Good evening, everybody, and welcome. And congratulations on all of you that are experiencing this wonderful miracle, because having a baby really is a miracle. I tried to find kind of an analogy of having a baby, and one of the things I came up with, it's kind of like a person on a plane, and you're the pilot, and your partner is the co-pilot. And I'm going to tell you that I've been a co-pilot many, many times. I have 5 daughters, 7 grandchildren. So I've been a co-pilot, and pilots need a good co-pilot, so I'm hoping you co-pilots are doing really well in supporting the pilots here. In addition, when I was an intern, I spent a month delivering babies, so I had more experience co-piloting at that point also. And then I'm an old guy, you can tell by looking at me, right? And so in the first decade or so of practicing out here, there were no neonatologists. So when mothers were having a potential delivery issue, C-section, early baby that may have problems, it was us, the pediatricians, that were there before the neonatologists. So I've been a co-pilot quite a bit of time, and I know what a special thing it is to be helping the pilots out there. So thank you so much. All right, we're going to talk about infancy, nutrition in infancy and beyond. And one of the issues about nutrition is it is constantly evolving. There's a lot of things I was told when I was in training that turned out to be true, and many things that turned out not to be true. In fact, some of the things, the opposite was true. So this is a very flexing type of area, and things that I'm going to say now, I'm hopefully all right. I'm going to try to stick to basics and things that are unlikely to change, but there may be some changes for the future as we learn more and more. All right, we're going to go get started. And also, if you have questions, there's a place to submit questions on the chat. I'll try to answer as much as possible. And you know what? They don't have to be about nutrition either. If you have other questions, we are involved in other things, myself and my partners. So if you have questions, I'd be happy to help you. Now, welfare of the baby starts before the baby's born. It really starts before the mother's pregnant. So a healthy mother is important to be. And one of the things I wrote down is that what we're talking about is nutrition. So what we're talking about is a famous statement saying, you are what you eat. You've probably heard of that. You may not know that it started in the mid-1800s. This is kind of paraphrasing what some French nutritionists said. And then in the 1900s, there's a book that came out, You Are What You Eat. And I'm going to show you that it's really, really true. You are what you eat. Anyway, so some things you can control. It's hard to control the genetics and some of the environmental issues, but you can control what you eat, and my goal is to try to give you the best information to help that. So we're going to talk a little bit about all those things. So I am a member of the breastfeeding section in American Academy of Pediatrics. It maybe biases me. It does bias me towards breastfeeding, and I'll explain why. But it also gives me a lot of information, things that aren't normally available to the public, a lot of science and information that isn't normally available, and that helps guide me also. All right, so what's the best? Don't forget the baby's nutrition starts before the baby's born. So what's the best nutrition for the fetus? A nice, healthy mother. And there's 2 parts of nutrition. One part is avoiding things bad. The other part is promoting things good. So what are bad? And most people know about these things like alcohol, tobacco products, toxins such as vaping. Heavy metals are bad, and we're talking about mercury. What you breathe sometimes is bad. There's toxins in the air. There's organic compounds that are bad to breathe that cross the placenta also. So we want to avoid things bad. I'm going to mention a little bit about metals, especially mercury. So one of the things we like to do is have mothers avoid fish, but it's more complicated than that. So some fish do have a lot of mercury, and those are the big fish, and some fish have very little or none. So there was a study done in England looking at mothers who ate fish 3 times a week, compared them to mothers who ate no fish at all, and the fish they ate were not the mercury-containing fish. They were the smaller fish that are very unlikely to have mercury. And they looked at babies' cognitive development when they were about 4 or 5 years old, and guess what happened? Those babies whose mothers ate the healthy kind of fish 3 times a week, their babies had better cognitive development than the ones who didn't. So it's not an all or none type of thing. Some of these things we say are absolute, and they're not really all absolute. So that's some of the things to avoid. How about some of the things you want to eat? So one of the things we're learning more and more about is the definition of a real food. So basically, the more you eat real food, the better your health is going to be for a lot of reasons, and I'll go over some of those reasons also. So real food is food that's grown, like fruits and vegetables, and food you prepare. So if you can just kind of separate those two things, avoiding the bad, promoting the good, chances are your baby will start having a good start in life. And we know from old studies that were done that babies are born with some problems at birth. So we know that some babies have these fatty streaks in their arteries from the time they're born. And that's because of the mother's diet before she's pregnant and the mother's diet during pregnancy. So getting a good start is really important. The last line on here is the microbiome. So the microbiome is an amazing thing. This is one of those areas of research right now that's teaching us so much about nutrition. So I think I have a little bit more. Oh, now I can't read my slides there. So, all right, so the microbiome, let me talk a little bit about that. The microbiome is all the bugs that live in your system. And there is, if I can read that, I wrote down, I did a little study on that. So the microbiome, there's 100 trillion organisms in your body. 100 trillion organisms comprising 100 different species. 90% of those are bacteria, but there's also viruses that live in there. There's yeast that lives in there. There's one-cell organisms that live in there. And that part is called the microbiome. In that 100 trillion organisms, there are some we know are really good and beneficial. There are some we know that are really bad. And there's this whole group of organisms that we're not really sure exactly where they fit. But these organisms are really important. They've done studies just showing that a significant part of obesity is related to what lives in your intestine. Your health is related to what lives in your intestine. Your level of immunity and protection, all those things are related to what lives in your intestine. So promoting a good microbiome is really important. And one of the things that helps promote a good microbiome in diet is real food. Fruits and vegetables promote that really, really well. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about how to feed the baby. So as I told you, I am on the breastfeeding section in the American Academy of Pediatrics. And obviously I favor breast milk. Is it a bias of mine or is it based on a lot of science? I'm going to tell you it's based on a lot of science. I didn't start out that way. When I trained, we were not trained very well on how to feed infants. So this is a lot of stuff that's come out over the years. So what is the same thing, we'll say, between breast milk and formula? So there's really only two things that are identical. It's water and lactose. And not all formulas have lactose. And some formulas try to get rid of lactose. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about lactose. So lactose is a sugar that has two different sugars combining to form this one sugar. It's called a disaccharide. And the sugars are glucose. Now glucose is it is the most important sugar. That's what we use for energy. And we have to store energy. It gets stored in the liver as glycogen. When we're not eating, it gets released and helps fuel us. But the other part of the lactose molecule is called galactose. Now galactose is really important for neural development. It winds up being important to kind of protect the nerve cells, kind of to shield them, protect them, forms a covering around them so they don't get damaged as easily. And every mammal species has galactose. It doesn't exist anywhere in nature. The only place lactose exists, lactose, is in breast milk, and every mammal species has lactose, so it has to have a lot of importance. So that's something we don't want to get rid of, and we definitely don't want to use formulas that are lacking in lactose. Now, how about other parts of milk that's different from formula, we'll say? So in human breast milk, the protein is basically two different categories, whey and casein. And usually advertisement from formulas say we have the same ratio of whey and casein as breast milk. They may have the same ratio, but no two mammals have the same whey and no two mammals have the same casein. So they may be broadly related to each other, but they are detail-wise very, very different. How about the fats in milk? So you may or may not know, but breast milk is loaded with cholesterol. No formula has cholesterol. And one reason is when they first started making formulas, the fats in cow milk were not absorbed. If they're not absorbed, the baby became calorie deficient. So they had to find a way to replace the fats and the fat particles in cow milk with something that has calories and still can be used, and those are medium chain triglycerides and other kind of fatty compounds. So the fats are entirely different in breast milk and formula too. Talked about the sugar. Now, lactose is the predominant sugar in breast milk and in some formulas, but also there are other sugars in breast milk, and those sugars are called oligosaccharides. They're really tiny sugars, and those sugars help promote a really good, healthy microbiome. We talked about the microbiome being important for health. Super, super important. It needs support. The support is the lactose and these oligosaccharides. Breast milk also has helpful bacteria, and these bacteria live there for a long, long time. It also has cells. It's a living structure, and those cells are kind of unique because they survive the stomach acid, and they go into the baby's intestine, and they set up house there forever. They may last the whole lifetime of the child. It's a living structure. It's different in the morning. It's different at night. It's different on day 1. It's different on day 30. It's always evolving. Now, vitamin D is one of the things that we think may be lacking in breast milk. It's really not a vitamin. It's actually a hormone. But there's 2 ways to make sure babies get vitamin D. One way is to supplement the baby. The other way is to give the mother a pretty good dose, like 5,000 to 6,000 international units a day. And that seems to be the same as the recommendation for how much vitamin D to give babies. Again, the microbiome is the next topic I have in there. I just can't stress how important it is. The things that help set up a microbiome when the baby's born is vaginal delivery, number 1, breastfeeding. So what happens when a baby has a cesarean section? There is a little bit of difference in microbiome in babies that have a cesarean section than have vaginal delivery. And people are now doing research on if you swab the mother's vagina and then swab the baby's mouth, can you transfer some of those healthy bacteria to the baby so they can have the same microbiome as someone who has vaginal delivery? So keep an eye out for that. That information will come out in the future. It's being studied in some places already. Breast milk has some really unusual things that people don't know about. We know it lessens the risk of middle ear disease and ear infections and allergies and asthma, less autoimmune diseases like type 1 diabetes, less cancers like leukemia, less serious infection, seems to help cognition. But there are some things that are really unique that you don't hear about. And I'll give you a couple of stories. So one of them is mother kangaroos. Mother kangaroo has a baby called a joey. That's the baby. She breastfeeds the baby. She gets pregnant again. She has another litter, and she's breastfeeding 2 different litters now. She makes a different milk when she breastfeeds the one of the joeys versus the other. She doesn't make the same milk. So there's some kind of recognition going back between mother and baby about which baby kangaroo is being nursed. When I trained, we had a lot of infections in newborns with E. coli, a special type of E. coli. You know, it's a very common bacteria in the intestine. And there's one called the K1 E. coli. Now, we noticed that the only babies who ever got sepsis, got severe infection with E. coli from this K1 species were babies that were not being breastfed. Turns out the mother's breast milk was making a special antibody against her own K1 E. coli that was being secreted in the breast milk. Thyroid. There should be no thyroid hormone in breast milk normally. And yet there are some babies who are born thyroid deficient that all of a sudden the mother's milk starts having thyroid hormone. So there is communication going on between the baby and the mom, so there is some direct communication. Again, there's something special about breast milk. If possible, you should breastfeed. If you can't, you can't. And if something comes up, sometimes it's just not possible. When you can, there's also a little bit of a difference between direct nursing and pump breast milk. There is some differences. Again, there's that communication going on. It sets up a slightly different microbiome. There's certain ingredients that go into direct breastfeeding. Again, some communication between baby and mom. There is a website on the bottom there that I would, anybody who wants to get breastfeed, I really want them to see that little website, www.firstdroplets.com. It's really great. website for teaching you how to get the really good latch on the baby. One of the most important things to do to have successful breastfeeding or less problems or make things easier is the latch. The latch is really, really critical. And this is a great short video that kind of promotes how to do a really good latch with the baby. Long slides, I know. So I hope that covers a lot of what we're talking about in infants after they're born. How about during the first year of life? When do you introduce solids? Well, the recommendation from the American Academy of Pediatrics is to introduce them somewhere 4 or 6 months, maybe a little early, maybe a little later. If they're breastfeeding, especially a little bit later. Now, there's 2 committees in the American Academy of Pediatrics that are often at odds with each other. One is the Committee on Nutrition, and the other is the breastfeeding section, and they don't always agree on everything. So sometimes they have to kind of iron out these differences and come up looking at what does the data show, what does the study show, et cetera. And the studies tend to indicate that for breastfed babies, probably waiting till 6 months is a better thing to do. For formula babies, maybe a little bit earlier, because again, we're not sure those babies are getting 100% of what they need. So what are the benefits of solids? Well, there's only so much calories a mother can produce with breastfeeding and so much milk a baby can drink if they're formula fed. So they do have to get extra calories at some point. Again, definitely for most situations before 6 months, it's not needed. And one of those important solids is iron. Turns out that iron deficiency, you don't even have to get anemic, but if you become iron deficient in the first 2 years of life, it will affect cognitive development. And sometimes that development's gone forever. So we do want to prevent iron deficiency. One of the other little stories about breast milk and iron is there's not a lot of iron in breast milk. And why did nature do that? So it turns out iron is important for babies, so why does the breast milk not have very much iron? And one reason is because iron feeds some of those bad bacteria that live in the intestine. The good ones don't really need it. The bad ones really need it. So when there's a little bit of iron in breast milk, but it's really highly absorbed, it does the same thing as a lot of iron that's poorly absorbed. And that's what happens in formula and a lot of the foods. So babies will need extra iron at some point for something, and your pediatrician will monitor that, I'm sure, for sure. How about allergies? Well, there's more evidence now that early introduction of a variety of foods seems to lessen the likelihood that that child would become allergic. So there's a big push now to introduce a lot of different food groups, certainly by 9 months of age, probably somewhere around 6, 7 months of age. The exact age is a lot of opinions, so we're not exactly sure when, but earlier than we used to think. Different food groups so they can get experience with those foods. And you actually want to keep using those a little bit. It's not a one-time exposure to those different food categories that helps prevent those allergies. It's kind of a continual exposure. So what order should fruit be introduced? So we know what we do commonly. It's not based on a lot of data. It's just kind of a lot of opinion. The one food that we do want babies to get, again, is iron at some point. So iron in food. How about the iron in solids? Where does iron come from? I mean, we all know about Popeye and his big muscles because he ate spinach, and spinach does have iron. The problem is iron in vegetable matter is not really well absorbed, so it's not a really good source of iron. The 2 good sources of iron are from animal products, meat. I hate to say that for those who are vegetarians, but meat is a good source. And so is the baby cereals. Baby cereals are fortified with iron. So if you want to look at what are the best sources of making sure your baby doesn't get iron deficient once they're old enough to eat foods, it's going to be one or both. You don't have both. It could be all cereal. It could be all meat. It could be a combination of both. But those are really good sources of iron for the babies. And in terms of the order they're introduced, it's really a lot of it is just based on opinion. The main thing is to introduce food slowly so you can tell if your child does tolerate that food group or doesn't tolerate. It's hard to tell with one food introduction. So maybe every day or 2 days or 3 days introduce a new food so you can kind of stay up on what is or what is not, what's causing problems, what's being well tolerated, etc. There are some foods we really do want to avoid in babies in the first year of life. One is honey. And another thing you want to do is make sure the texture of the food babies are getting is mushy enough that they're going to digest it, and it lessens the likelihood of having a choking hazard too. We'll go to the next slide. So how about once they reach a year or so, what do we do? So there's this big push that when they reach 1, it's time to change, if you're on formula, formula to cow milk. If you're on breast milk, could you stop breastfeeding and introduce cow milk? So where does that information come from? There's no science on it. The American Academy is very, very careful about how they word this statement, and I'll explain why in a minute. So according to the American Academy of Pediatrics, babies should be, if they can, be breastfed through the first year of life and thereafter as mutually agreed. As long as mom and baby are on board, you can nurse as long as you want. There's no cutoff date that we know of from a medical point of view. And then what about formula-fed babies? So it says, for babies who can't breastfeed, the American Academy of Pediatrics says, formula is an adequate substitute during the first year of life. Doesn't say stop, doesn't say continue, and they're very careful to avoid that. And the reason they're careful to avoid it is because something like 40 to 50% of the babies in the U.S. are on WIC. And if they said babies stay on formula, that would be a huge, huge financial hit to the government. So they avoid that question completely. So you don't have to take babies off of formula if they're on formula. When they reach a year, you can still feed them formula longer, or if you want to switch to whole milk, you can do that too. But it's not a better product. It doesn't have iron. It doesn't have some of the other things that formula does have. Formula, we know, is a pretty complete nutrition. Otherwise, babies wouldn't survive very well on it. Babies cannot be fed whole milk from birth. We know that. So what is the right amount of whole milk? Let's say they're on milk. How much is the right amount a day? The key there is they have to be less than 32 ounces a day. So what happens when babies drink more than 32 ounces of cow milk a day? They bleed. You may not see it. It's microscopic. There's special tests that can pick it up, and they will become anemic. They will become iron deficient. And again, that's one thing you really want to avoid is iron deficiency in children. So what's healthier? Whole milk, low fat, non-fat? Well, my training has been get rid of the fat, non-fat is healthier, but this is one of those things, as I mentioned, we're learning things that a lot of things we're taught may not be true. More data is now suggesting that whole milk is healthier than non-fat milk. And there's a lot of reasons for it, and I won't go into it right now. But so non-fat milk is not a healthier product, and the fat in there doesn't seem to be an issue. The fat in milk is different than the fat in meat. So we're looking at saturated fats now. So where the saturation points are on saturated fats is really important. So the saturation points on meat products is in a very unhealthy place. And it turns out the saturation points in dairy products is in a pretty good place. So the feeling is slowly switching to maybe we shouldn't put babies on low-fat or non-fat milk, and we should keep them on milk once they're on milk too. So what foods need to be avoided for toddlers? The number one food that needs to be avoided is sugar. And that's what we're finding more and more. For what's left, some bad foods have been removed from diets and from stuff you can buy in the store. Sugar's still out there, and sugar is addicting, and that really is damaging. The more we learn about it, the more we learn how damaging sugar is. How about if I have a picky eater? Well, that's tough, because parents make sure their children eat, and some parents are more upset about it than other parents. But one of the things I've learned from a really, really smart pediatric endocrinologist named Robert Lustig, and I'm going to give some little snippets that are good to know, because if you learn that, it'll help you solve some of the situations you have. So he says it's not about calorie balance, it's about calorie deposition. What does that mean? Does that mean it's not about how much you eat, it's about where what you eat goes in your body. And that's a really important point to know. So if you have a picky eater, one of the things you have to remember in the back of your mind is it's not exactly about how much, but it's what they're eating. It's important. And we talked about the microbiome. So one of the other effects of the microbiome is causing what we call a leaky gut. A leaky gut means things get into your intestine, and instead of staying there, they leak into your body. The intestine doesn't block some of those bad things from coming in, and those are slowly damaging. How do you know if your child is getting enough fiber? I would say look at the poop. Fiber, don't forget, you're not going to get good fiber from a pill or little liquid stuff that you mix in water and stuff like that. There's two kinds of fiber. There's soluble and insoluble fiber, and to have effective fiber, you have to have both. And both come from real food. That's the fruits, the vegetables. That provides not only real both soluble and insoluble fiber, but it feeds the healthy bacteria that live in there, and they stop that gut from being so leaky. Go to the next slide. So what kind of strategies can you use to help the picky eater? Again, remembering that statement, it's not about how much you eat, it's about where those calories go that's important. That's far more important than the amount of calories some child eats. How about involving the child? We've tried things with our kids and our grandkids, involve the child in growing foods. So sometimes they're a little bit better trying things that they've seen grown and that you pick and make. How about letting them choose some of the foods, like when you go shopping and stuff like that? Sometimes that helps. Be creative in ways of preparing the foods. And again, every child is different. There's not a really good answer because every child who's a picky eater has a different solution, and some have no solutions. But again, remembering in the back of your mind, it's not about how much, it's what they eat that's really, really important. So why is all this early life feeding stuff so important? Because this is when the damage begins. So by the time we get to be an adult and we get arteriosclerotic heart disease, we get diabetes, we're pretty much at the end stage of the process. It's almost like, I like to liken it to a monopoly board. And during life, you're going along, except in the monopoly, and unlike monopoly, when you get to the end, this is when you're in bad, bad shape. So all along life, you're doing things that are bad for you, very bad, and we're talking about nutrition now mostly. You're doing all these bad things that hurt your body, hurt your arteries, promote chronic diseases, diabetes, etc. And then when you finally get to the part of the monopoly board where you're near the end, you can't go backwards. You're pretty much at the end stage. So our job is to go all the way back to the front and try to prevent those things from happening. The more you do when they're young, the longer they'll live healthily. So I'm going to mention a couple of other one-liners that I learned from Dr. Lustig. And by the way, he has a really good book out, and I'm trying to remember the name of it. I can't remember the name of it, but he's written some excellent books. Fat Chance. My wife is here. She's good for helping me in a lot of things. So there's a book called Fat Chance by Robert Lustig, Lustig. I recommend everybody read that. So one of his other one-liners is you can't out-exercise a bad diet. So what does that mean? So if you exercise a lot, you do aerobics a lot, you stay in good shape a lot, that's really good. It's good for your heart muscle. It's good for your body. Doesn't change your arteries very much. So it's not enough. That's a really good part of making you healthy, but the diet is also a really, really important part. So Dr. Lustig and two other really, really smart endocrinologists wrote the best article I've ever seen in American Academy of Pediatrics journal called Pediatrics. And this was called A Unifying Concept of Metabolic Syndrome. It was published in 2012. It's a fabulous article, hard to read, but fabulous article. It's very, very scientifically detailed. And one of the things they talk about in metabolic syndrome, so metabolic syndrome is what leads to chronic diseases. That's what leads to bad arteries. That's what leads to diabetes. It leads to a lot of different chronic diseases. And in there, they list 4 foods that you really need to avoid to protect yourself from getting metabolic syndrome. And the first one is partially hydrogenated oil, which has pretty much disappeared, thank goodness. That's probably the most damaging thing we had in our diet up to very, very recently, and it's been slowly, and I'm not sure if it's 100% gone, but it's really hard to find anything with partially hydrogenated oil. That's pure evil. Eating that is just pure evil. The second most evil one, and the one we consume the most, unfortunately, is high fructose corn sweeteners. So why is fructose corn sweetener bad? So fructose is, again, a sugar that has 2 parts. It has glucose, the good part, but then it has that fructose is the bad sugar. There's sucrose, which is what we use for table sugar, has fructose and glucose. Sorry about that. So what happens with fructose? So fructose is in a lot of foods, natural foods. And you get fruits. That's the primary sweetener in the fruits you eat is fructose. So why is it bad to have it in a high fructose corn sweetener like sugar drinks? Well, the fructose is metabolized by the liver. That means the liver is the one that takes it apart and puts it in different pieces and keeps it from destroying your body. And the liver has a very, very limited ability to to digest and metabolize fructose. It can only do a small amount at a time. And when you overwhelm it, that fructose molecules change to a lot of things that really damage arteries. It goes swimming around your body, causing lots and lots of havoc. You don't want that to happen. So how can you have fruit that has fructose, but not high fructose corn sweetener? So the reason you can is, again, those fruit has both the has the fiber that, again, is both the, I'm about to block here now, on the fiber is as both, Tracy, can you help me? So the fructose in fruit has fiber, basically. It has a soluble and insoluble fiber. And for some reason, that soluble and insoluble fiber keeps that fructose from being absorbed. So you may be eating it, but very little of it gets in your body when you get it in that form. Now, let's say you drink a glass of orange juice. Let's say there's 8 oranges making a glass of orange juice. Well, if you ate 8 oranges, you would not get the same kick in fructose in your body as you drink a glass of orange juice. So avoiding sugar sweeteners is really important. And artificial sugar isn't any better. As it turns out, artificial sugar may even be more damaging than actual sugar. It appears to be so in animal studies, and it appears to stimulate insulin production as much as sugar, and that's probably one of the damaging ways that all the sugar hurts us. So that's not an answer, is not to use. An answer is not to use artificial sweeteners. The third food to avoid is alcohol, and I'm sure none of you out there drink any alcohol, right? Okay, especially in pregnancy. So alcohol is kind of similar in that the body can only handle a small amount at a time, and high amounts really release a lot of chemicals that, again, can damage arteries, can damage the liver, etc. So in very small amounts, it seems to be fine, but in large amounts, it's really quite damaging. And the fourth food is this thing called branched chain amino acids. So amino acids are the little things that build proteins. It's like if you're building a house, you have bricks. If you're making proteins, which are really important for the body, you have to put together all these amino acids. And there's something like, there's a little argument about how many, like 27, 28 different amino acids, but somewhere about 9 of them are essential. In other words, you can't make those. You have to eat those. And in that category 9, there's 4 that are branched, and I misspelled it, it's branched chain, should be chained, not change, amino acids. And what is the problem with branched chain amino acids? So they're just like alcohol and just like fructose. The body, the liver can handle small amounts, but not large amounts. So where do you find these branched chain amino acids? Basically in meat, in red meat especially. So small amounts are fine. Again, large amounts, you overwhelm your liver's ability to metabolize them, and it leads to damaging products. There's actually 3 ways where red meat can be damaging. One is large amounts of branched chain amino acids. The second thing is, it turns out, remember I said how the microbiome is really important? There is a microbiome that's associated with arteriosclerotic heart disease. And those bacteria are fed by red meat. So there's something about red meat that makes those bacteria grow a lot more, and they're potentially damaging. And then the third part is the way the fat is saturated. Again, it's saturated in an unhealthy point. So those are 4 foods that are a good start to avoiding some chronic diseases also. Again, the most evil food is sugar. Now, sugar is a combination of glucose and fructose. And the fructose part is the damaging part more than the glucose part. And it's addicting. It goes through the same addicting pathways as heroin and some of the other addicting things that we do. It's not as strong, and the withdrawal is not as bad, but it follows the same addicting pathways, actually. So read labels. Look at added sugar. We don't care about sugar that's naturally in food, like fruits and vegetables, but added sugar you really want to keep an eye out for. And again, all these sugar drinks, things that we've been consuming all these years, that's why we have such a huge problem in our society with a lot of chronic diseases. So these are, again, before I finish, these are some one-liners that I got from Robert Lustig. I'm going to repeat some of them. I'm going to tell you some new ones also. And it's a good way to remember a little bit that can fan out to help you decide what you want to eat and don't want to eat. So number 1, you can't out-exercise a bad diet. Exercise is really important. The bad diet is still going to damage your arteries, even with a lot of exercise. Number two, it's not about calorie balance, it's about calorie deposition. Again, how much you eat is not nearly as important as what you eat and where those calories go. And here's one I didn't mention before. Everybody makes a big deal about glycemic index, but it's not about glycemic index, it's about glycemic load. And what do I mean by that? So carrots have a high glycemic index, but for carrots to be damaging, you'd have to eat probably 30 or 40 of them. So the load in each carrot is really tiny, even though the glycemic index is high. So look at glycemic load, it's much more important. And again, saturated fat is a simplification. Fats are really important for health. There's good fats, there's bad fats, and there's some in that middle range again. Eating good fats is really critical for health. Things like olive oil that has monosaturated fat is really important. So really look at what kind of fats you're eating. That's really important, and where the saturation points are. And again, you really are what you eat. So simplify, just try to eat real food. I think that's my last slide, and I don't know if there's any questions. Everybody knows everything, so that's good. If there's anything, other areas other than nutrition you want to ask, be happy to answer those too.